One Question is brought to you by Turnkey Search, a top industry search firm since 1996. I want to start with a question around College World Series scoring. So far in Omaha, we're averaging around 4.8, almost 5 runs per game. Conversely, in the Super Regional play, we averaged around 8.4 runs per game. And look, I know these are super small sample sizes, but this conversation around how the game is played in Omaha versus how it's played the rest of the season, do you have a sense that this is going to continue to be a point of conversation with coaches within the ABCA as we move forward beyond this year? We've already seen a number of 1-0 games here the last couple of days and some low-scoring games. What's your sense on how they view that issue?
Well, I think our game's in incredibly good shape right now. We're in a good position, and the change of going to the flat seam baseball, this being in our second year, really allows guys to drive the ball, and they're rewarded for really squaring the ball up. The lower scores, that I think that's a good number where you play the game properly, playing good defense, being in good position, not allowing guys to steal or to bunt them over and then hit for a little bit of power. That's right on par with where Major League is their averages are. I like the way the game's being played and what we're doing. And on top of that, I think there's some things with it. Like you said, it's a small sampling size, but this is the best pitchers in the country facing the best hitters. And, the old adage that great pitching beats, great hitting. And just like you see in the World Series, great pitching and lower runs or lower scored games and so forth. So I think the coaches are very pleased with where we are. I think since we went to the flat seam ball and seen, 17 to 20 home runs, it looks like we're on par for that or possibly more for this World Series when we just had 3 home runs in back-to-back years, not last year, but the year before and the year before that. Something needs to change in the flat seam, I think, was introduced at the right time and the right place.
Let's step back just a bit, and I probably should have asked this question first. And I think a lot of the listenership to this series, and maybe by and large to D1 Ticker as a whole, other than ADs and administrators who have sport oversight for the sport of baseball, detail the role of the ABCA in policymaking for the game. Obviously, it's not the final say in terms of how the game is governed. That would fall to the NCAA. But you guys interface, of course, with the NCAA quite intimately on the rules front. But give us a quick review of how that process works.
Well, we're very fortunate. We're one of just a couple sports that has the opportunity to meet with their Division I. So for example, I meet directly with our Division I baseball committee, and with that has NCAA staffers on that, of course, and that's made up of ADs and commissioners. And so we talk about the state of our game, and I think they rely fairly heavily on us and give us opinions and facts on where our game is going and ways in which they can improve our game. And so just give you a couple examples. I'll go to Indianapolis in November, meet with the Division I baseball committee, and I will bring 4 coaches, leaders of our game in the country and bring them there and talk about issues that we think need to be addressed and give our opinions on it. And what I really respect about the Division I baseball committee is we take the gloves off and talk frankly how it affects baseball coaches and how that consequently affects student athletes. And we talk about we're here for the student athlete, but unless you're talking to the coaches, that does not work its way down to be in the best interest of the students many times. So I feel really good about that. But getting back to your question, the ABCA cannot put legislation forward. We can only try to gather facts, get the position from the coaches, and we do that through surveys and phone calls and so forth. But surveys are our number one way of getting that. Find out the percentage that's in favor, and when we have piece of legislation and they're high in the count, so we're looking at 70-75% of the coaches would like to see a change in that, we start working on trying to affect change. And like I said before, the ABCA cannot put legislation forward. That has to be brought by an institution or a conference. So we'll talk to the different conferences and individual coaches, try to get a piece of legislation that's in the best interest of our sport pushed forward.
So well before that November meeting in Indy, there's this September 1 deadline, of course, of when you guys have to submit potential legislation to the NCAA. You also referred to this high count or high majority on issues that really start to make its way towards that submission to the folks in Indy of 70-75% of majority. What are the issues right now, Craig, that you think could come into play to submit by September 1?
Well, and just to sort of clarify on that, last November we've been working on stuff to get to this September. So we're not 3 months behind, we're 9 months ahead, if that makes sense. So in November, we had the issues that we're trying to push forward for this upcoming September. So November of 15, we're working on issues for September of 16.
Sure. Right.
And so we were able to push through or get enacted the two-piece legislation on quiet period, and that's taking coaches off the road during quiet periods and not allowing them to work camps or clinics and get them back in touch with their own student athletes and, quite frankly, their own families. So that was a piece that 88% of our coaches were in favor of. And then also moving the quiet period, extending that by 1 week in the last week of August, which gets them off the road 1 week earlier so they can be on campus when their student athletes show up and get them, enrolled and so forth. So those were two pieces that went forward this year, and those will be in effect of August 1st, 2016. Then the four that we're currently working on right now, and I'm gonna give it a little caveat with that. The first two did not meet a large majority, but we thought it was in our best interest to try to get it to a vote. That would be the minimum 25% aid that baseball student athletes must receive, or they can't get anything. And then 27 student athletes on aid, a maximum of 27 student athletes on aid. Those are two pieces of legislation that was enacted quite some time ago, I think it's 7 or 8 years ago, to try to help combat the APR issues that baseball was having. Since that time, baseball has made a fantastic turnaround. We're at about a 971 APR. And with that said, our academics are very good. There's some reluctancy to take both those away, and we're the only sport that has those two-piece legislation, by the way, but there's some hesitancy because we've made such a good progress on our academic front. But with that said, we're only a little over 55% of our coaches are in favor of removing those two, and the only reason we're pushing to a vote on that is because we're the only sport that has those two pieces of legislation. So that's where we stand on those two, and then we have an overwhelming majority of our coaches are in favor of the next two, and that is adding one additional assistant coach in the sport of baseball to bring that up to 3 paid assistants and 1 head coach for 35 student athletes. That's certainly under the average or ratio of coaches to student athlete. And then the other piece of legislation is 4 fall games that would not count towards the 56 in the championship segment, which would be in the spring. We have some difficulties with all of these. The first two that we don't have a large majority, and then the one versus the additional coach, with all that's going on between lawsuits and cost of attendance and figuring out where we're going to go with that. There's probably a money issue on many campuses. And then the 4 fall games, not to count towards the 56. The one situation with that is that the NCAA and member conferences are trying to do away with other sports like softball, soccer, volleyball, and lacrosse that all have those non-traditional segment games that don't count against their competition. They're trying to remove those. So as they're trying to remove them, I'm trying to add ours. So we got 4 pieces that are going to be very difficult to move this September.
How do you think coaches within your membership would respond if the 4 in the fall actually counted against your 56?
Well, I think they would be rather upset. We've talked to them about that, and our sport, the sport of baseball, for us to play about 25% number of games compared to our pro counterparts. So, pro baseball playing a little more than 4 times the number of games we're playing compared to what basketball, that's about 3 times more pro basketball to college basketball, and then football is almost right on par with the number of games, and the other sports fall into the same situation. I think that'd be very difficult, because trying to talk student athletes into coming to high school when they're a high round draft pick, if we played less than the 56, that'd make it a little bit tougher, that's for sure.
Yeah, interesting. And you've been around the game for so long, and of course your dad was the previous executive director of the ABCA for 2 decades, right? Around 2 decades.
That's right.
What rule changes, say in the last 10 years, have you seen that have been extremely beneficial for the sport? And for me personally, the one that comes to mind, of course, is the change in transfer. Having to do a year in residence when you transfer. But what others come to mind for you that have improved the product on the field, but also the student athlete experience?
Well, I think you hit it the nail on the head with your example of that. But quite frankly, the 25% minimum aid, I think, is playing a big part of our parity. Right now we're seeing teams rise up, make the NCAA tournament, and quite frankly, making it to the World Series between Kent State and Indiana, Stony Brook, and now Coastal, that have made the World Series that were nowhere to be found, quite a few years ago. And then you have some of the traditional powers not even making it to the NCAA tournament. So those 2 pieces of legislation have probably played a pretty good role in some of the parity, which some people think is fair and some people not. And then certainly the power conferences don't like it, and the non-power conferences do. So we have quite a battle between the haves and have-nots, and sometimes that breaks down to the north and the south as well. With the transfer thing, the transfer piece of legislation, that certainly is helped, where a school gets a very talented young man and they turn into a great baseball player, maybe have great tools and turn into be an excellent baseball player. And before they used to, quite many times, transfer to a different school, and now we're not seeing that. So I think all 3 of those have helped us out tremendously, and they certainly have helped with graduation rates and our academics.
Last question, and I'm always curious to get a response on how leadership, ADs, commissioners, senior leaders, yourself, when you're physically at the games in Omaha, are you commonly engaged with your NCAA counterparts so much that you don't watch the games, in detail? Or when you do watch the games enough, are you constantly looking in the dugout to see how coaches are reacting? What do you enjoy most about being in Omaha, and how do you physically watch the games?
Well, I love the people. I love to visit with our coaches that are competing there. Our board members are there. We run our board meetings at the at the World Series. So I have 40 board members that I'm entertaining and also conducting meetings with. So we'll meet all morning, and then we take them to the game. So I'm with them talking about, our next moves with the ABCA. So it's all of the stuff you described, where you're taking in the whole championship. You're sort of living through our student athletes and seeing the joy they're getting out of the game. You feel the crowd and the kids and all the things they're getting out of it. Because some of my fondest memories when I was 8, 9, 10, 12 years old, going with my father to the World Series back when it was in Rosenblatt, and the great experiences I had. But all of those things I'm taking in. I meet with Major League Baseball there, and we talk about issues and how we make our game of baseball better. I meet with the NCAA and the Division I baseball committee members and catch up with friendships and talk about issues, talk with our board, and then of course watching the game. So sometimes you're doing business, and sometimes you're watching the game as a fan, and sometimes you're watching the game to see how different coaches manage their club and have good benefits, and sometimes they're a little too tight and have tough results. So it's probably all of those things you described.
And that's today's One Question, brought to you by Turnkey Search, a top industry search firm since 1996. One Question is designed to give D1 Ticker subscribers valuable insights on how executive leaders in college athletics think about key issues on their respective campuses, in their departments, or within their leagues and conferences. One Question is brought to you by Turnkey Search, a top industry search firm since 1996.